Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the final episode of the Human Risk podcast for 2021. In this show, I'm exploring something that sadly we'll all be familiar with: disagreement. Although we humans are social animals, naturally driven to form close-knit groups, we're also very good at becoming partisan and competing with one another. That competition can very quickly lead to mutual hostility. My guests are two of the co-authors of a book called Poles Apart: Why People Turn Against Each Other and How to Bring Them Together. They're also the co-hosts of a podcast called Change My Mind, where they interview people who have, well, as the name implies, changed their mind. One of my guests, Alex Chesterfield, has been on this show before, talking about her work as a behavioural scientist in financial services. My other guest, Ali Goldsworthy, has been a political advisor and campaigner for more than 20 years. In our discussion, we explore how and why polarisation affects every part of our lives, influencing everything from our friendship circles to our approach to health issues. And we look at the practical steps we can take to narrow division, build respect for others, and create a greater degree of common understanding. It's a fascinating subject that I think serves as a fabulous closeout for the podcast in 2020, and as we look to a new year full of hope and optimism that things can and will get better. As ever, thanks for listening to the show. Let me wish you an early happy new year, and please enjoy my discussion with Alex Chesterfield and Ali Goldsworthy on depolarisation that I think you're really going to enjoy. Alex, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, and Ali, welcome to the podcast. Now, given Alex, you've been on the show before, why don't we get you to introduce each other? So, Ali, can you introduce Alex and vice versa?
Yeah, so Alex Chesterfield is my co-author on the book Poles Apart. She's a behavioural scientist and a recovered politician, I would say. Nowadays, she was a Conservative councillor in Guildford, which for your American listeners is a small town outside London. It's like being a state legislator, I guess. But more than that, Alex is thoughtful and she is reflective and she is fun and she is a brilliant person to work with. As I'm sure people will come across, she has a degree of precision that is rare for me to experience and makes people who work with her better all of the time.
That's super kind.
Be kind, Alex.
I love how you make being a councillor as well sound very, very grand. It is a lowly elected councillor, but I did enjoy it. So my turn to introduce you. So when I met Ali, she was definitely chief troublemaker at Which, and now I think you are most known for trying to build bridges and cross division. So Ali is also a recovered politician, so ex chair of the Liberal Democrats. And for years and years built campaigns and tried to achieve change through mobilising the masses. So we met at Which, and then Ali went over to Stanford and set up their first depolarisation course. And then from that launched the podcast and brought me and Laura on board, for which I'm ever grateful, because after the podcast then followed the book. So just as Ali said about me, we could not have done this without Ali. And I'm sure as listeners will find out, if they stay on, she is incredibly hilarious, but also very bright and very, very sharp. So you come away with one thing, you're going to come away with a laugh, but also learning at least 5 new things.
Beautiful introductions. And so you used to work together. And then, Alex, as you were saying, the podcast came about. Ali, can you talk a little bit about the podcast and the genesis of it?
Yes, the genesis of it came when I was at Stanford, which, for a bit of context, I went immediately after Brexit and the election of Donald Trump happened while I was out there to help put on the first course. And while we were there, we got Stanford was at least cosmetically a extremely Democrat-leaning campus and included the business school. Like there was no Trump-supporting member of faculty, which is weird when 50% of the population voted for him. And, it's got the Hoover Institute and a bunch of, Margaret Thatcher was a visiting fellow there. You'd expect there to be allegiance to the Republican Party. But someone in the audience, a woman called Karen, asked some Trump voters, she just said to them, when was the last time you changed your mind on something and what made you change it? And there was sort of an intake of breath. And then the first answer came from a woman called Kat, who's a friend now, actually. And she said that she'd been brought up to think that, gay people were the devil, basically, and then had gone to university, and her roommate had been a lesbian. And she realized how wrong she'd been. And a few things happened in that moment. So the first was that people suddenly realized that having that conversation was worthwhile, because it wasn't just going to lead to people entrenching. The second was that actually she started to throw it back out to other people, like challenge them to think about the same thing. Because once she'd started to model that she could change her mind, it encouraged them to do the same thing. And I think it wasn't what people expected from a Trump supporter to say that they had changed their mind on that issue. And I just thought this was a tremendously interesting thread to be pulling at when you're trying to depolarize. Like, what does actually help change minds as opposed to mobilize people and get them to take action, which was what I'd always been obsessed with as a question. And that was the thread that we started pulling at. We found it a fascinating question to ask all sorts of people. I brought Alex on board because I didn't know enough about behavioral science, and I brought our co-author Laura on board because we didn't know enough about business without her. And together, the three of us, launched the podcast, which has been tremendously successful.
And it's a phenomenal listen. And obviously, what you clearly you don't pick people that haven't changed their minds on things, because that'd be a pretty short-lived episode. But you're picking some really phenomenal stories there. What if you just sort of tell us one or two so that people can get a sense of the sorts of people that you've talked to?
Yeah, so I'll pick one, and then maybe Alex, you pick one as well. Yeah. So one of our guests was a guy called Derek Black. So Derek is he's American, and his godfather is David Duke, who is Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan. He grew up in an extremely white nationalist household, and he helped his dad actually set up Stormfront, which was one of the first, basically neo-Nazi websites and comment forums. And then he went off to uni. He went to his state college here for funding reasons that makes sense in America, in Florida. And he began to meet other people. And initially he hid his background because he knew it wouldn't make him popular. And then people found out about it. And he was completely ostracized by a lot of people, except one Jewish guy who kept inviting him for Shabbat dinners and kept talking to him. And then slowly, over a period of many months, and although, the Ku Klux Klan is known for being, anti people of color, it's also pretty anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic as an organization. And, that was a remarkable thing that he did. And then over this period of time, Derek slowly learned to renounce his previous views. And it's tremendously unusual that happens, actually. And our interview with him sort of dug into that and how he felt about it and what the result was with his family because he was, in effect, leaving his family by choosing to leave that group. And it's a very, very powerful listen, that podcast.
I'm going for two. The first one that comes to mind is Eamon Dean. So Eamon Dean, he's not a household name, but I really urge listeners, if they're going to listen to one episode, vote for mine, listen to Eamon Dean. So he's an ex-Al-Qaeda bomb maker, and he changed his mind on Al-Qaeda and what he did as a living, and then ended up becoming an MI5 spy. So if ever there was a 360-degree change in beliefs and also behaviours, he epitomizes that for me. But it's a really, really compelling story. And he talks about his nephew, who he failed to change his beliefs, and his nephew ended up dying in his efforts to, in the Middle East. So extremely personal story. And he really regrets, what he sees as his own personal failures for not being able to change his nephew's beliefs whilst doing this amazing 360-degree turn himself. And he's just a great storyteller. So he came on and told his story. So if anyone's out there, I urge you to listen to Eamon Dean. My second favourite one was actually one with Cass Sunstein, who probably will be more familiar to your listeners. So just for those who aren't, Cass is probably one of the world's most preeminent behavioural scientists. He's actually a Harvard law professor, and advises many governments and organisations around the world, and is obviously one of the co-authors of Nudge. And he came on, and what Cass changed his mind on was the fragility of US democracy. So for years and years and years, he was always really confident in the stability of democracy in the States, and thought it could resist any outside influence. And then the events in the last year, and particularly, it's nearly a year now, isn't it? At Capitol Hill last January, when it was stormed, it really shook him to the core and his very foundations in democracy. So that was quite hard hitting, again, the way he tells that story. He also reveals some really interesting stuff on sludge and some more unknown behavioural insights that I wasn't aware of, some of the things that he was talking about. So again, it's worth listening to for how he tells his story about what he changed his mind on, but also some of the insights. It's like a freebie that he gives away.
3 fabulous episodes, and I'll put links to those specific episodes and the show as a whole in the show notes. And so you've got this show going. How does the book then come about?
Well, I suppose, and this is like the kind of fantasy thing that isn't really meant to happen to people, but we just were like, we think people kept telling us that they really liked it. And what was unusual about the podcast was that people would listen to the thing the whole way through. And that degree of engagement is really, even, to start with, it had a fairly small listenership and then it grew and grew. But they really liked it. And we just thought there's more to this. And we should think about writing a book. And all 3 of us in various roles have been involved in book production before, either submitting chapters or giving reviews. And we were like, do you know what? If we don't offer to do this, someone who knows less than us, probably a guy, which will irritate us, will come and write this book. And it's like us that's doing all the legwork and the cool thinking, and we all get on really well. So let's stick a book proposal together. We know how to do that quite well and see what happens. And we got introduced to one editor who actually ended up being our editor at Penguin Random House, and sent him the book proposal. We didn't have an agent at this point or anything like that. We didn't know quite how that was all meant to work. And he came back with a significant deal that we signed to prevent us going with anybody else. So we were 3 authors without an agent to do things. And then quickly there was a scramble. And this is where having like great mentors really pay off. So the 3 of us all went back to like old bosses and we're like, so there's a significant book deal on the table and we don't really know what to do about it. Do you have an agent who can help? And what did it? And it was an absolutely kind of crazy sort of couple of weeks and that then is how we did it. And Nigel, our editor, was superb, and I would say made us think very hard and become more eloquent in how we expressed poles apart and give it a consistency, which for 3 authors is quite tricky. So we really liked them, and that's how the book deal came apart. And I think that happens. There's something like a 1 in 300,000 chance of that, given the number of book proposals that people get every year. So it was, that was it. And then we went and wrote the book, and we makes it sound simple and straightforward.
I was going to say, it makes it sound very linear.
Yeah, it definitely, when COVID hit, it became a lot less linear. And when I got pregnant, and then Alex and Laura became teachers on top of everything else that, like with many people, it was, and any listeners who think it was a simple and straightforward process, I would encourage them to dwell on the fact that we're just not swearing a lot about some of the difficult parts. They definitely existed.
And I've got to admit, when I heard you writing a book, I was very excited, right? Because I love the show. And I must admit, I had concluded that you were going to follow a route that lots of other people have followed, which is the sort of, well, we have a podcast, right? So let's just pull together some thoughts of stuff we've heard in book form, and maybe we'll add a few little things in there. And that's why and that would have been great, by the way. Not a criticism of people that do that at all. But you've gone completely into a piece that is a standalone work that really does, and you've got some fabulous quotes on the cover for some really prestigious people saying pretty much this is a definitive work that covers a whole range of things. And so you've gone into academic research, you've pulled in stories from the podcast. This is a serious bit of work, and it's by no means boring. I don't want anybody to think this is some tedious academic. It's not. It's super engaging. But you really went for it. I'm super impressed that happened. Was that a conscious decision in the first place, or did that sort of just come out of the fact that you had a big publisher and you needed to produce something?
Well, I'll go first quickly because I'm about to pay Alex a compliment, which she is never associated with anything that lacks rigor. So if Alex was involved, it was always going to stand up.
Apart from this show, obviously, but there's an exception to every rule.
And be really thoughtful. And that was part of, all of us bring different strengths to the team in different ways. And undoubtedly, Alex has an eye for detail and thought and pulling things across that I don't. It's where we all complement each other. But we wanted to write a book that was going to be useful and be used in 10 years' time as much as it would be used today. Matt Chorley from the Times, when he was reviewing it, he sort of said, what's amazing about this book is, it's not just this is why we're all falling out about Brexit. it's much more considered and thoughtful and placed in a broader context. And I think that was the pitch, the publishers, and that's part of why they picked it up, is that it would be, that they said it would become the standard text, so people would still be using it in 10 years' time, and that we very much hope is the case.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it was both. I mean, I love the research side. I'm a massive geek, so for me it was stressful, but it was also very enjoyable going to all the research, trying to piece it all together. But definitely, though, and I remember generating several draft chapters, and Ali and Laura, our third co-author, like, this is great, but it's like a textbook. Like, let's make this more of a story. So it was definitely combined. What's the phrase? Some greater than its parts. That Aristotle.
Yeah. I wouldn't have known it was Aristotle.
You know the gist.
I just thought it was something from The Simpsons.
You know the gist.
I mean, I know it's older than The Simpsons, but I'm sure I've seen it there.
Lols.
Yeah, we definitely, and we also knew, because we'd worked together before, like, that we had established norms and ways of working. Like, we were all people who delivered, and like, we were women of our word. And I think that de-risked, given this is called the Human Risk Podcast, that de-risked the project for us a lot.
Yeah.
And has, even now, so we've finished the book, we've got paperback, we've got a new edition to write, all of these other things and work coming in. I can't imagine a time in my life now where once a month, Laura, Alex and I are not going to get a bottle of wine and pick each other's brains for like an hour, because it's now a very strong unit, I'd say. I mean, Alex might be about to tell me she's had enough of us.
No. It is definitely that. And it is, I was going to say also the editor, and, they set the bar. So we set the bar high ourselves, but then I think Penguin set the bar high right at the start. We want to commission this seminal analysis of polarisation, or at least a more contemporary UK focus, because most books and most of the research comes from the States. And to some extent we were hamstrung. We call that out as well. But so the bar was set, I think, by us, and then at an even higher level than the editor. And he very much was a fourth author. So I've never seen so much track changes. I mean, we all pride ourselves on being able to write and synthesize material, but he did do an amazing job as well, like really lifting it at the end.
Yeah.
And can you just talk us through the structure of the book and what the sort of flow is?
Yeah, it's like a diamond, isn't it? That's how I always think about it. So if you can imagine a diamond shape in your head, it starts off with the individual. So where do our beliefs and views come from as individuals? And then if you imagine that, going into the outer edges of the diamond, we then go from the individual and where our beliefs and values come from. So almost, why do we think what we think? And then it goes into the groups. So actually, how do we form the groups that we form? Like, from an evolutionary perspective, why do we have groups? What purpose do they serve? But then we look at, well, actually, how do groups influence? Why are we attracted to join or identify with some groups over others? And then again, the converse, how do groups influence our own individual beliefs and values? So it's very much I was going to say bi-directional relationship, but a two-way street, essentially. So one influences the other. And then that broadens out to why and how groups can sometimes become us and them. So, groups, we definitely need groups, and groups can be amazingly collaborative sometimes, but then they can break down into that us and them, and that's where it can get toxic. And then we then go further out from us and them to then looking at the, external forces that then exacerbate these innate tribal tendencies to form into us and them. So that's why we look at things like technology, so the effect of social media. Ali, we should definitely come on to that, because the evidence is quite mixed, and it is quite easy, I think, just to blame Facebook. So we look at, social media, tech, our institutions, so politics, media, also factors like economics, so inequality and uncertainty that are correlated, not causal, but correlated to increased levels of polarisation. So we look at the whole system. And then if you imagine again coming back in the diamond, we then come, right, well, okay, this is a problem. How do we then fix it? So how can we change systems and institutions? So at that system level, how can we change groups? And then finally, how can we change ourselves at an individual level?
Ali, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's my summary.
No, because Alex is always your consummate complete package. So I have nothing to add to my brilliant co-author's work.
But you should talk about the social media. Oh, sorry. I was going to say.
No, go on. Take over the show. Go for
so
it.
I think this is what problem when you get two other podcast hosts on, right?
Yeah.
But I'm delighted. Crack on. Nobody tunes into this show to listen to me, right? It's the guests. So please,
just before we go there, Christian, what have you changed your mind on?
So do you know what? I knew you were going to ask this question. It's been fascinating for me. So when I left full-time employment and moved to self-employment, I had a little bit more time on my hands to read stuff, and in particular, to listen to things. And so I found myself listening much more to people that I'd sort of caught snippets of on social media. So James O'Brien on LBC would be a good example of someone that I have had a lot more time to be able to listen. So rather than just getting those social media clips that he does, which is sort of tend to be rants or him, tearing apart people, very thoughtful contributors and guests. And so the thing and I hadn't even realized it was so ingrained was the whole idea of the sort of social security and benefits. And I had bought into this narrative of, oh, well, we're just encouraging people to be lazy. And it was through hearing stories on his show and then doing a little bit more research myself. And I mean proper rigorous research as opposed to the sort of Facebook conspiracy theory research, but genuinely looking at these and thinking about it, I've changed my mind. I'm much more of, becoming more left-wing as I get older, which I know breaks all of the rules. But I think it was hearing those stories. And the only reason I was able to do that was at 10 o'clock in the morning when his show is on, I'm not required to be in some tedious meeting that I have no interest in being in. I can flex my day around it. And so I find myself curiously drawn to that. And that's opened my mind to a whole load of other things. So I'm much more now in a position where I think we should be supporting people. And yes, there's a cost of course, there's going to be a few lazy people that make the headlines, but there are a ton of people that need it. And I think particularly now under COVID. So that I didn't realize quite how ingrained the opinions were, but I've massively shifted now into we really need to do more of this. And so it's been a fascinating experience. So that for me has been the one. And I think there's a load of other things that come off the back of it in terms of how I perceive the world and what we ought to be doing and what we should be doing for other countries, let alone just within our own one. And so that for me has been the real eye-opener.
No, and that's and I would say I've had the same experience with James O'Brien. So if people haven't listened to his David Runciman podcast, which is really thoughtful, where actually he talks about how he changed his mind and how his upbringing, like how he had to confront quite a few things from it. It's incredibly considered. And from James's social media profile, you would never have any idea that that's how he is, because he takes exactly the opposite tactic. So, he uses deliberately inflammatory content to build engagement and to get an audience. And that's the case on most social media platforms, not all of them, but most of them do that, and they reward that with success. And they reward that not just through the algorithms of success. I mean, it's people, but like that also plays to our natural tendencies. So what Alex was talking about how we form groups and how that can be really helpful, but also how you can trigger dopamine hits and all sorts of things. That's not useful. One thing that's probably just worth dwelling on with social media, and I should preface this by saying Facebook, well, Meta as it is now, so Facebook in all its forms, like undoubtedly a principally polarizing force. Also Twitter, in that it mutes moderates and it amplifies extreme voices. And when it does that, it makes you think out groups, which can be people who only slightly disagree with you on an issue, but are identifiably like very, very different for some way. It gives a more extreme version of that and reinforces a stereotype. So then you start like bouncing between places, getting more and more extreme and more distorted. And that's in effect is the mechanism of social media, where it can often polarize. But the thing is, people often say, well, it's all Facebook's fault, and quite a bit of it is, but certainly not all of it. Because if it was, you'd think in history we've never polarized before when there wasn't social media, and clearly we have. like that's nonsense. And we like to have a convenient baddie, and it being, Facebook does make itself a very it's basically a James Bond villain of a baddie, isn't it? Like it's really easy to blame. But things are more complicated, and most people have got their own personal responsibility in how polarization is happening and how they respond. It's like, oh, I'm being completely controlled by Facebook and manipulated by their newsfeed. Well, you could choose not to look at it. Like people could go and get their news from elsewhere. It's like people abdicate their own responsibility, and that there's nothing else driving it. And I think that is, Alex touched on earlier, like economic factors, uncertainty, all of this kind of stuff can also push polarization. And if we got rid of Facebook tomorrow, do you think that polarization would disappear? And the answer most people give to that correctly is no, it wouldn't, And I think that's part of it. There is there's obviously a huge amount that regulators and Facebook itself could be doing to change things. Twitter too, particularly. There's some of the other platforms. Some operate more thoughtfully. We don't dig into this enough in the book, actually, but I'm quite impressed by how Reddit has, because they had to deal with extremism quite early on the platform there because of how it grew in with what's called Gamergate. If people are interested, I can give you some links for afterwards. And in the run-up to the 2016 election, before things really hit on some other platforms. And some of their solutions are more counterintuitive. Things like they allow bots on their platform to help transparently identify people, which I think in terms of picking out misinformation, disinformation, or getting people to loosen views is a really interesting model in terms of how they create their communities and like the norms that each one have. I think there is some very interesting stuff out there where you can mitigate the bad sides of polarization. That's pretty inherent whenever you start generating some belonging, not always, but generally. And people don't really think about it. So I guess that I could talk about social media. In fact, we have an event on with a German organization 1014 tomorrow with a bunch of top academics looking at this. But yeah, basically don't blame it all on Facebook, but do blame a bit of it.
But Christian, I know you were an ex-regulator, and for any regulatory orientated listeners, it is a kind of behavioural market failure. So where people gain something individually from using and engaging with social media companies, but in aggregate that can cause harm. It's where companies make money and it pays to polarize through the way that consumers behave. And increasing competition in, for example, social media, so more companies coming to the market to do the same thing, wouldn't help the problem. It would actually reinforce it and make it worse. So how do you protect people almost from themselves? Is that question. So I think there's a lot of parallels between what you see in social media and polarization, all the harms that it causes, with when you look at financial services markets and the behavioural market failures there. So think about teaser rates, for example. Teaser rates appeal to that instant gratification.
So this is for listeners that aren't aware. This is when you get really, really low interest rate to sucker you. I'll put it in very crude terms, to sucker you into something, and what you don't realise is that rate is going to go up at some point.
Yeah. And because also we're present biased, so we tend to overvalue the present and today and discount the future. We typically think, oh well, I'll switch in the future, or I'll get this great deal now, but we don't ever switch. Or the more sophisticated consumers do, but the less sophisticated consumers don't. So it kind of raises really difficult questions about how the way in which consumers behave and how that impacts markets at large. So it's a similar phenomena.
That's really interesting. And I was struck by, Ali, your comment around, we blame Facebook and because it's easy to do that and social media in general. But actually, there's something inherent in us that does that. And one of the things that I took away from reading the book that sort of went against what I thought was conventional wisdom, well, the reason that we sometimes make bad decisions is that we are cognitively lazy, right? So the brain's a huge consumer of energy. So we make quick decisions, and that's for very good if you're evolutionary reasons that we want to save energy. And therefore, we jump to conclusions that perhaps aren't helpful. But what you highlight on a number of occasions in the book is actually that the decision-making that drives polarization, the sort of confirmation biases, actually in some cases can use more energy. So in other words, we're making a special effort to put ourselves in that position. I thought that was fascinating. Can you unpick that a little bit?
I think you're spot on, Christian. I think when we started the book, and this is a view of many experts as well, is that our group identity, so the groups that we identify with, it doesn't necessarily mean we're a member of, but we identify with. So it could be a football team, a nationality, a gender, a political party, act as a kind of heuristic, so a shortcut designed to help us process information quickly and evaluate it more quickly. So what that means is that we use the beliefs and policies and values of our in-groups, so whether it's our football team, our nation, our gender, whatever, to help us quickly filter all the information we see day to day. Well, what should I pay attention to? What should I listen to? And also, what should I think about it? So exactly as you said, that kind of strategy requires very little cognitive effort. So it makes sense from a kind of, an efficient brain perspective to conserve our energy and focus on where it matters and actually just to use our group as a kind of shortcut. So that was the thinking for a long time. But actually, I think what researchers found was that if we are motivated less by truth and accuracy and more by loyalty to the group can actually take more cognitive effort to scrutinise arguments and counter arguments in order to defend our beliefs. So I identify as a member of a Conservative Party that is loosening increasingly, but I still do. And what that means is that if I see information that might challenge my beliefs, it takes more mental effort and more sophisticated cognitive abilities to ignore those that information that might conflict with my beliefs and use it in a way that actually supports my beliefs. So there's a couple of psychologists called Charles Tabor and Milton Lodge, and again, we can give the reference in the footnotes, but they demonstrated that when it comes to politics, those with greater levels of political knowledge can come up with more counter arguments, which means we end up coming to a more biased evaluation because we only think of reasons in support of our arguments rather than ones against. And there's a great study that helps to epitomise this by a Yale academic called Dan Kahan. It is a bit controversial. Again, we can provide the footnotes, but urge listeners to read up on it. But what he found is that he gave a bunch of people a maths problem to solve. And he started out with the hypothesis that an ability to solve a maths problem should have nothing to do with a loyalty to an in-group. It is an objective maths problem after all. But what he showed was that if a maths problem has any kind of whiff of politics about it, that will have an impact on people's ability to answer it correctly, which was really fascinating and supports this other research that actually it takes more mental effort to defend your beliefs than it does to oppose them. So what he did was he first of all assessed volunteers' natural maths ability and then got them to answer questions about crime data for cities that ban handguns and for those that don't. And he found that once the kind of political or ideology part or dimension was added, people's mathematical ability ceased to be a reliable guide to the accuracy of their answers. So whereas liberals tended to be really good at solving the problem when the correct answer proved that gun control reduced crime, conservatives were better when the answer proved the opposite. So basically, people with really high numeracy skills were unable to reason analytically when the correct answer collided with their political beliefs. It kind of shrouded their ability. And again, this is quite controversial, but one theory that Kahan developed after those studies is that people who score highly on various indicators of information processing, like political sophistication, something called cognitive reflection, so our ability to kind of reflect on why we're thinking or how we're thinking, are more likely to express beliefs that align with those of their party. And again, this is quite controversial because what it means is that people that like to think of themselves as more progressive are actually more open-minded. It means that necessarily isn't true. And again, there was other research. I remember, Ali, you talking about this, or in presentations we've done to people who are really interested in changing the world, actually we say you are more likely to be biased than others, or others who are less politically involved, for example, which is not what you expect.
So there's and I would say that was as a former political activist, and I was a Lib Dem, so we were quite good at winning where I was, but in general across the country, the Lib Dems never won that well on their own and always had to work with others. So it's not like I was a successful Conservative like Alex was. I was just successful. I
was very much love.
You were just not quite successful enough to run the country on your own and needed a bit of help from us for a while. And that triumph of success that was the coalition government. But one of the things that really stood out to me was that. And I'm slightly paraphrasing, a fantastic woman called Leo Zimgren, and one of the highlights of the book actually was finding some younger academics' brilliant work and getting to showcase it. And she is a classic of this example. And she did research with people on the left and the right to look at what's called cognitive flexibility, in effect, like how able are people to, think about things in a different way or outside their tribe, I suppose, to a certain extent. How much can they pick up on a change of instruction when they've been, kind of asked repeatedly to do a task? It's sort of how she ran the experiment. And what historically people have always thought that, the most rigid people were authoritarians. And what Leo found was actually, if you were particularly politically active on the left or on the right, you found it harder to reconsider and reflect on your own views. You were more likely to just keep when someone asked you to do a different task, when you were being asked to repeat it regularly, it was much harder for those people to change. So I'm slightly extending what she says here, but what I intuit from it is, if you are a political activist, there's a decent set of odds that doing that is likely to make you more polarized and find it harder to do things with other people. And as someone who has dedicated a good 15 years of her life to making people more politically active with absolutely zero thought about how I could encourage them to engage with others, I feel very guilty about that, because I think Lior is broadly right, and I was woefully negligent, and I think there's a lot of people, especially as you look at the growth of online campaigning movements, which was where Alex was talking about, when I go and talk to chief execs of organizations, they say 38 Degrees or Move On out here in the US, and you talk about what you do, suddenly it really is very tough. No one's you will think you're doing good things for democracy, and broadly you are, but I never thought if I was making any ill effects, and I probably was, and I feel very guilty about that. And I know a few founders of those movements who also feel pretty guilty about it.
I mean, that is absolutely astonishing, and it hits when you sort of start to unpick it that way, because that's counterintuitive beyond normal counterintuitive. You're basically saying if you focus on this thing, so you're trying to do the right thing, and actually you could make things worse.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of people who try and do the right things all the time and can make things worse. And that is not, I just want to be really clear, that is not a reason not to run those kind of campaigns or to do those kind of things. That's absolutely
don't get involved.
That's absolutely not the.
Greta, give up. You're not helping.
But there is a thing about you need to think about how you clear up that mess with what you're doing, rather than be relentless with, continue. That doesn't mean, again, that you don't hold the opposition to account, and voter choice and distinction between parties is important in a democracy, all of this kind of stuff. But I don't think anyone in those movements, certainly historically, has ever thought, how can we try and bridge some of these divides? How can we make sure that we're not just creating one group and playing them off against each other all the time? And I think that's, technology has accelerated that process, because it's reminded people of things more often, and information abundance means you slightly use more shortcuts, and you use your group biases to judge things a lot more. And I don't think anybody thought about that as a consequence, when we started doing these things. And that's, in hindsight, is stunningly obvious.
And another risk it raises, again, coming back to the subject of the podcast and shifting away slightly from politics and into organisations, is that, well, what it means, or the key insight is that often people will place more loyalty on, belonging and sticking with their groups above truth and accuracy.
Yeah.
And again, the way organisations function, if you think they're almost like big decision factories, and we like to think that decisions are made objectively. But once, people get into their functions or their franchises and their groups, what this suggests, and I'm generalizing from this research into organizations, but it suggests that people will make decisions based on loyalty to their group or their particular part of the organization, rather than objective evidence, which is worrying.
And more than that, you often get penalized for speaking out against your group, and that's not just
and we learn from that.
Yeah, that's not just brown nosing, and you get penalised for saying, I don't know. So it even encourages you even more to use some of those shortcuts and rely on your group stuff. And nobody ever thinks, we did a interview with an extremely senior British businessman, and we sort of said to him, hey, when you're thinking of innovation and diversity and inclusion, do you ever think of political diversity? And if you work in public affairs, people do that because you're basically hedging against the change of government. You want people from a range of parties in your team. So. But he said, no, it's never even occurred to me to think of it. Never, ever even occurred to him. And he had an extremely Remain-leaning contact book, which meant he had almost zero understanding of, relatively, of levers or what was going on. And that was quite a big lot of his customer base, And I think and they had no voice at anywhere near the top table. And that's really worrying when that stuff starts to happen. Conflicts start extending, people feel excluded from what's going on. It ties into all sorts of other similar D&I discussions. So one thing I should say we stop short of, very deliberately, is we don't believe that political views should become a protected characteristic in the same way that race or gender is. That is not where we're going with this. But it is the evidence is pretty clear that done right, you can get higher innovation and better scrutiny and all this kind of thing if you build politically diverse teams.
One of the other bits that I took away clearly from the book, and it's implicit in a lot of things you've said, is that the structures that we have in place nowadays, many of which are ostensibly designed to allow debate and discussion, actually have the opposite effect, or at least aren't as good. Best case is not as good as we thought, but in many cases counteract that. I wondered, you talked about social media. That's a clear thing where, yes, we can see the benefits, that we can share things with our friends, but we see the dark side. Are there any things that you've come across that were particularly surprising in terms of things that were unhelpful or downright destructive that we lean on quite heavily?
I'll go first, and then I'm sure Alex will pick up other things. So talk radio is a big one. So we brought LBC and James O'Brien. So actually in the US is relatively overstudied compared to everywhere else with much of academia stuff. But the polarization or effective polarization, this group-based polarization that we're talking about, has been on a steady rise in the US since they liberalized the radio stations and you managed to start getting talk radio. And that, again, a bit like social media, relies on, its profit motive is inflammatory, emotionally driven content, which the cheapest way to produce it is to do some of what James O'Brien does in here with the excerpts, or, on a much less palatable format, Rush Limbaugh used to do out in the US, and some of the shock jocks. And so that is quite a big driver of polarization, and people don't really think about it. I suppose another thing, when this is more an expression of polarization, I'll let Alex come through, is how people express their political views through the food that they choose to eat. So there was a really interesting study done in India where they look at, which is obviously both Hindu and Muslim, and the amount of beef that people will consume, which is not okay for Hindus and okay for Muslims, and even Hindu or Hinduish beef eaters, they would consume less meat at times of conflict with Muslims. And so that's how, and you always wonder about if that went in reverse and you encouraged, for example, people to eat more food from each other's cultures or things like that, would that help to try and reduce conflict? So I think that's some of the really interesting things about how people expressed these views and how it was very subtle. People would be like, no, I'm not against these things, but it would still show that the food that they ate changed, or if you think about back in the day of the Iraq War, when McDonald's had the freedom fries, people wanted to express their nationalism and their support for the US troops or the British troops, and they'd go and get their freedom fries. Alex, I've talked for long enough to give you time for an idea.
So for me, one of the things that one of the insights that jumped out from me is, so just taking a step back, what we know from decades of social science is that as soon as we identify with the group, or we label me as an us and say Ali as a them, is that then triggers a whole bunch of positive feelings for the groups that we identify with, and equally triggers more negative feelings about people who are on the other side or on the other team. So just hold that insight in your minds. Most organizations, when they are pursuing diversity and inclusion strategies, will focus on what is different about people. So, they'll have, mentoring schemes focused at particular minority ethnic groups, or programs, to increase, for example, females at higher levels. And I don't know, one that really challenges the findings from the social sciences, that actually we are by highlighting what is different about people, we are then creating potentially more division and more animosity and more hostility between people, when the goal is actually to bring people together. So what the evidence suggests, and Jonathan Haidt is brilliant on this, what the evidence suggests is that we should really focus on highlighting what we have in common, and what is what do we all have in common, what unites us, rather than what divides us. And I see so many organizations going about it this way. And I think this is a really important area for testing, because the evidence will suggest we're going about it in totally the wrong way, and it's going to drive unintentionally worse effects and more division and more hostility. I'll give you an example, an anecdotal example, and then a more scientific one. But in a previous organization, I remember, one of the senior directors standing up and announcing a new Bain mentoring scheme, which, is I think is needed, as in something is definitely needed to tackle the problem that it was designed to tackle. But I remember being in the lunch queue later and hearing people behind me who were older, white, male. So clearly a group of people who the mentoring scheme was not targeted at, and they were really pissed off. And for them, it had created a whole bunch of, negative feelings that weren't there before against people that they had not, felt those things about before. But they felt, well, hang on, what's here for me, or how. So now I'm not saying that we shouldn't stop doing those mentoring schemes because it will evoke those kinds of feelings, but it's an anecdotal example of how you can start to get those effects unintentionally. I'll give you an example. There's a study by, I can't pronounce his name,
Matthew Lewandowski, yeah.
Matthew Lewandowski, yeah. So again, he took that same principle, actually does highlighting what different groups have in common, help to bridge divides and bring people together rather than divide them. And he did various studies, again, in the States. And he found that, for example, highlighting national identity, so we are all American, actually worked to bring people much more together rather than highlighting what is different. So I'm Republican, you're Democrat.
Matthew's work, basically, he did it around Independence Day, so July the 4th, and he tracked how people felt, how hostile they felt to other groups. And you wouldn't think that, like, political view had that much to do with a bunch of people waving Stars and Stripes banners and, like slightly ridiculous hats, often made in China, I have found, which always makes me laugh slightly, even this year. And, but, he found that actually hostility between those groups dropped as it highlighted they had something in common. So you would expect something like the Olympics, to also reduce things as people had a common identity. And certainly, if people, think back to the 2012 Olympics and the UK, you would expect hostility between different groups had dropped quite dramatically at that point because people are primed. What's salient is the shared national identity. So that is where I think Alex is really on something. It's one of the proven ways to try and depolarize stuff is you almost, I think of it, she might tell me off for using this, but she's not here, so I'll roll with it. I'll use a layman's explanation, which is you try and fool your brain into someone being in your in-group because you have something in common with them, and you put that front of mind rather than focusing on an out-group and where you might have a point of difference. And that is a much easier way to start solving things with what goes on. And if you think about, in a different context, for example, financial services, that's often how scammers work, is that they will phone someone up and they'll be like, oh, I had this too, or oh, this was my, that's, it can be used to depolarize. So Alex and I will often bond over whose child is making more noise in the background or refusing to go to sleep. So my last message from Alex before we did this podcast was some tips from her for me on getting through teething with a small child. I have to say, like, small children are massive depolarizers because, like, literally everybody has been kept up through the night or been peed on or like pooed on, and like there's no glamour to it, but like everybody can or most people can empathize with it.
Well, we have a story about that in the book, don't we? Was it the American? Was it Ronald Reagan and?
Oh, it was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter did it.
That was it.
Camp David.
Yeah.
When he was doing some of the Palestinian-Israeli stuff, he reminded like both the people involved, who was clearly in the 70s or early 80s because it was Jimmy Carter, that he reminded them, that they were both grandparents and they all talked about being grandparents before they went on to anything else. And I suppose I think of this in a different way, that I never really understood sometimes the value of small talk. I'd go with like my boss to meetings with like big people, like chief execs of BMA and stuff. And they'd spend like these two guys, it would be like an hour long meeting, be like, there's loads to get on with. And they spend the first like 50 minutes gossiping about like complete bullshit, right? But what I now realized they were doing was in effect priming their in-group to be like, oh yeah, we're all getting on really well. And then they'd go and wham through everything in the last 10 minutes. And I'd have to try and attempt to work out how it would all be negotiated from there and be like, oh, these people have signed it off. And I remember being extremely frustrated by it at the time. But in the process of writing the book, I was like, no, this is actually really quite a smart way to do things. And there's a value in small talk like that I had not previously appreciated.
And that's what Maggie Neal says, isn't she? One of the Stanford professors that was on the podcast. She's an expert in negotiation, very commercial negotiations, and was saying that was one of her key insights, was around approaching negotiations with a mindset of how can we both win from this? How can we both understand where each other's coming from? and understanding what the common ground is, not going into a negotiation with that zero sum, one of us has to win, one of us has to lose type mindstates that only ends up going south for both.
And that's fascinating. Thank you. Some amazing stuff in there, and it's illustrative, I think, of the sorts of things you explore in the book. It's a nice little microcosm of one issue that's picked up. But I mean, it strikes me that when you talk there are lots of things that we have inherited down the way, which was the basis of the last question, of sort of the terrible, right, awful ways of doing things. But actually, there's quite a few things that we do as a species. For example, the small talk. For example, the idea that we'll go and break bread with someone, because that actually are very, very powerful. So there is something in us that can lean into these things and has them built in. And yet we've also built constructs that do precisely the opposite. And so I think it's really interesting when we look at some of the traditional, so some of the quote unquote inefficiencies. And I loved your comment, Ali, because it reminded me of sort of, the conversation. Why have we got all this stuff why have we kept all this sort of, PPE would be a good example. We don't need to have massive stocks of PPE. That's a waste of money. And, supply chains, redundancy, as in sort of, having spare capacity under a 21st century logic. Well, that's rubbish. We get, management consultant logic. Let's get rid of that. That's a waste of money. And yet, as you pointed out, a lot of these things, actually, they seem pointless and useless and counterproductive, but actually incredibly helpful. And so as I was going, it occurred to me there are lots of processes that our forefathers and mothers came up with that actually help some of these things. And so in a way, there is a point to sort of going back to being a little bit more human around things, because many of these problems, I'm not saying they've solved them all, and clearly we have 21st century dynamics, but there are lots of things that we can grab hold of, actually, that point in the direction you're suggesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it's on the supply chain stuff, like interdependency in terms of trade generally helps reduce hostilities, right? And it makes people feel better about other nations. Is what, we only touched on it fairly briefly in the book, but one of my favorite studies is where there's, I believe there's a Palestinian stock market, and a guy gave a Stanford faculty member who's fantastic. He gave some Israelis some money to invest in the stock market and tracked that they became significantly less likely to vote for, or significantly more likely to vote for peace-seeking parties as a consequence. So just a really small stake, like $50 in something, like can change people's behaviour. At the same time, I wonder if things then don't deliver, or if they go really badly when you're interdependent, do you start blaming others more quickly? And how, is that part of the global supply chain crisis with what is going on? But, I suppose part of your point, and where polarization becomes really dangerous, like some polarization is a really good and helpful and natural thing and essential, is when it extends significantly into other areas. So when it affects, how happy you might be about who your child married rather than if they'd make them happy, when it affects who you might hire, or who you may live with, or all of this kind of stuff. And all of, if you're, and what Alex was saying is almost all of us, are affected by this. So there's evidence about, kind of, they're not quite actors, but like extremely educated people who make decisions on big infrastructure bills or infrastructure projects are much more likely, if the person that they voted for was elected, to support them. And that, to me, is probably not what should be affecting, if a big bridge gets built. The Channel Tunnel, for example, should not be built on the basis of whether the actuary doing the funding for that thing voted for the person who was there. And that's not to say it's a conscious level, like it's a subconscious level that a lot of this happens. And that becomes pretty dangerous for how society starts living together once you start fracturing it at that, once polarization gets pernicious.
You mentioned it there very briefly, and we should probably just touch on it, is obviously conflict sounds like a bad word, but you do in the book make clear, and you just have in your comment, Ali, around that we need this. We do actually need to have a certain amount of disagreement, what we might politely term challenge, but actually in getting better decision-making, we do need to have a degree of conflict. So your book isn't all about saying, let's eliminate all conflict and opposing views and make everybody think the same. Do you want to just talk a little bit around that? Because I think that's a really important thing for people to
we don't talk about this bit, you don't use this term in the book, but for the philosophers in your audience, Chantal Mouffe's work on agonism and living with agony, basically, and how we all need to get a bit better at that. For more layman stuff on it, Ian Martin's book, Conflicted, is really good as well. But being an amorphous blob would be really boring. We wouldn't have much innovation. We wouldn't have good scrutiny. I don't want to be the same as everyone.
Progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think Alex is amazing. It would be great if I was the same as her, but then she wouldn't be unique. So that would be very fair in the world. It's. I think that is really, really important. And the other thing people often think when they talk about polarization is, I am right and you are wrong, and the way to solve this is for you to change your mind and to agree with me. And that is also not the point of what we are talking about. Like, part of it is that you might be wrong, but also that someone might have had different experiences that has given them a different perspective, which is entirely valid. So maybe Alex can talk. I'm slightly mindful of time, but maybe Alex can talk briefly about, a concept called the illusion of explanatory depth and how you reach decisions, because I think that can be really quite a powerful driver for individuals when they consider how they interact with things to try and loosen some of their more polarized views.
Happy to summarize that, but I just wanted to make a comment on your point, Christian, again, coming back to organizations internally. So that same misunderstanding, I think you can see in organizations when organizations talk about psychological safety, which is obviously part of the inclusion when we talk about diversity and inclusion. So psychological safety is the idea that within a team or a group, you feel sufficiently safe to take that, what's called an interpersonal risk. So you risk your ego, your reputation, your career prospects to challenge, to say, I don't know, to admit a mistake, to say, I think we should try something new. And psychological safety is really important for outcomes that most organizations want, like innovation and stopping small problems from becoming much bigger problems. But the misunderstanding and the issue is that a lot of people translate psychological safety as being nice and being kind and not setting the apple cart. And again, refer listeners to Amy Edmondson, who is one of the, key recent researchers on psychological safety. And she often says, this is not about being nice. So again, as a key message, this is not about being nice. It's creating the conditions to feel that you can challenge safely without having all the negative effects of challenge, which is why people avoid it in the first place. Yeah. Right. Interpersonal. Sorry, what was it? Illusion of explanatory depth.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be really quick on this. So this is.
That will take as much time as you need, because I think this is. I think this is really important. So don't rush it.
So illusion of explanatory depth is a phenomena from a researcher called Frank Kiel. So again, Kiel. And he started doing this research on everyday items like zips and toilets. And the idea was he got people to try and explain exactly how they worked. And initially, most people were like, I understand how a zip works. Or I understand how a toilet works. Flush it and then, your waste.
How hard can it be,
exactly.
right? I use one every day.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, once you're probed to, mechanistically, step by step explain, well, I flushed the toilet and then inside I have to stop now because I don't know how it works. People get stuck and they realize that actually they understand a lot less about how the world works than they think. So they went a step further and applied that concept or that phenomena to political attitudes and beliefs. And again, what they found was really interesting. So very similar. They found that people thought they knew a lot more about their issues or their positions than they actually did. So say again, for example, Brexit, people, would hold or believe very strongly that they could explain why they believe Brexit was a good thing because of the effect on the economy or on, other societal outcomes. But once probed, exactly how do you think voting to leave the EU is going to lead to that outcome, people realised they couldn't do it. And once they realised they couldn't do it, it meant they held onto their views less tightly, or put more simply, they became much more moderate. And that's why the link to polarisation is really interesting. And again, there's been a bunch of other research showing that actually just asking people simply to not explain why they think what they think, because that just leads to justification and rationalisation, but more to think how the position they hold will lead to the intended outcome. It means people become less confident in their beliefs and therefore more open to counter beliefs or counter information or another way of thinking about the world. So it's a really simple change. So shifting from asking people to explain why to how can actually have quite a potentially big effect on a whole host of different areas.
And I think that the reason I think this is fascinating is our natural tendency is to think, so if I'm trying to be helpful and engage with the other person, or even if I'm not, well, why do you think that? And we go into that emotional side of it. And that, of course, leads very often to people going, well, I'm not going to have I'm not going to be challenged in this way. And so they double down. Yeah. And so what I think is really interesting is that very subtle shift that you talked about there takes it away from the emotional and starts to get them to do the work thinking for themselves, as opposed to you're not battering them and challenging who they are. Yeah. You're just helping them unpick the logic of what they've thought.
Yeah, I should say, just by getting people to explain, so step by step, how something works, it means people, as you said, Christian, become much less defensive And there's much less risk, almost personal risk, to realizing that actually there are gaps in their understanding.
The other thing I would say is, like, as the listener, when you are, because I've ended up asking this question to a lot of people recently, it's also loosened some of my views, when you're the person who asks that question, because it's not just about the recipient. And it's made me realize that sometimes my perspective is not complete. Like, I don't have a total evidence base. Like, someone could have a totally valid viewpoint based on an experience I had not considered. So, whilst Alex didn't talk about the evidence, and I'm not sure how big the evidence base is for the person who is listening, that has certainly been my personal experience. And I think one of the biggest things that Alex and I uncovered was the paucity of work that actually tried to test solutions in this area. Like, there's a lot of people looking to seek to find who they can blame for polarization, or even like, oh, we'll adjust the like button on Facebook or do something. And like, again, like, it's there, but that but there's so much more to how polarization happens and what happens and what we could look to try and do things, that I just think stuff like the illusion of explanatory depth that Alex outlined, surely there's got to be a lot more threads there that we could be pulling on. And I guess that would be sort of more optimistic note I'd want to start to bring things to a close on, is that there are solutions out there, and there is things that we can start to do to reduce polarization when it gets as excessive as it is in a lot of places at the minute.
Amazing. I love that. That's a beautiful way to... Just before we close out, I'm intrigued. You talked about you're having to do more writing because the publisher, I guess the paperback needs some extra things. Where do we go beyond that? What's next on the agenda?
I think at the minute I'd say watch this space we're in. So we do bits of consultancy work, helping everything from startups to philanthropy to business to bits of think tanks, bringing things in. And, there's an increasing dawning realization in organizations that politics is being done to them and polarization is being done to them. And you can't, take the traditional Chicago school of thought of like, actually, we'll just sit out of this. And I think there'll be some pretty exciting threads that we pull at over the next few months and years to go from there. But the short-term answer is I'm just thrilled that we've written a book that is useful, that people message us and they say, this has changed how I'm doing things at work, or how I communicate, or how I talk to my family. And I think that's so mean. You want nothing more than that as an author, that people find it useful.
And in the meantime, if you want to dig deeper, there is also now a course. So we did one of the first MOOCs. So mass online, can't think what the other is, mass online education with Cambridge University on depolarisation. So it's a course, it's free up to a point. So most of the content's free. And then if readers want to get a certificate from Cambridge, they can then pay for that. But that is also a great way to test yourself. Again, coming back to that illusion of explanatory depth. Don't just read the book, go on the course. And it's a way to test yourself and help others to depolarize. And again, we've had leaders in organizations find it incredibly helpful because, again, as a leader standing up, leaders are more and more expected to talk out on issues like climate change, like, that blurring of what government is responsible for and what business is responsible for is becoming increasingly blurred. And most people expect businesses to stand up and talk about these issues, but in a more polarized and divided world, that carries way more risk. Yeah. So navigating that is really hard. So the course, I was going to say, recommend that as well. Is a great, more interactive way of helping and learning on those issues.
So here's 330-somethings went for a drink 3 years ago. Now have a podcast, a big global book deal, hit the Independent's bestseller lists, and a lecturers at the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College, Cambridge, which, that's quite a lot from a couple of drinks at Canteen on the South Bank.
I love it. And anybody that's listened to the show will know it. And I mean, your show and this one will know exactly why that's the case. Listen, I want to say a personal thank you for writing what is a fabulous book. I mean, it just literally blows my mind. I keep going back to bits of it, thinking about it, working out if I'm trying to work out why something's gone wrong in an interaction I've had, or how I can shift it's tremendously useful. So not only do you talk a lot about the theory, but there's some real practical stuff in there. So I want to genuinely thank you for writing it, because it's blown my mind in a really good way. But secondly, to say thank you so much for coming onto the show and being such amazing guests. I knew it was going to be great, but we had a great time. We learned I certainly learned some things, and I've smiled a lot, which is the biggest compliment I can pay anybody. So thank you so much for both of those things.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So that's it for this final episode of the Human Risk Podcast for 2020. Don't worry, I'll be back in the new year with plenty more episodes. My enormous thanks to Alex and to Ali for appearing, and of course to you for listening. To find out more about Poles Apart, their book, and Changed My Mind, their podcast, and the other subjects that we discussed in the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it on whichever podcasting platform you use, please do so. It really does help. To find past episodes of the show, visit humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back in 2022 with some brand new episodes of this show. But in the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful, peaceful, and fabulous new year, and all the best for 2022. Thanks for listening, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.